Welcome to The Debate. Today we are tackling what might just be the single most colossal and complex topic in human history: religion. For thousands of years, this structure has been the great architect of civilization. It's shaped everything from our political systems and written laws to our deepest definitions of moral good and evil. Its influence is truly inescapable.
And its significance is precisely what makes its impact so controversial, isn't it? I mean, we are looking at a system that spans every culture, every continent, and virtually all of recorded time. So the critical question that emerges from all this is this: when we look at the full arc of human history, was religion the necessary societal mechanism that saved us from, self-destruction? Did it provide the stability needed for civilization to even begin? Or was it the primary repressive force that systematically delayed our progress toward real scientific discovery, rational government, and individual freedom?
I'll be taking the position that religion was an absolutely indispensable social and moral technology. I believe that without that framework, the scale and complexity of early human society simply could not have survived long enough to flourish. It was, I think, a required step.
And I will argue that human progress, particularly that profound acceleration of enlightenment, science, and rights that we've seen over the last few centuries, was achieved primarily despite the dogmatic and restricting authority imposed by religious institutions.
Well, my core defense really rests on historical necessity. I mean, just consider the ancient world. Before the establishment of formal states, unified legal systems, or even a rudimentary psychology, early societies were constantly on the brink of chaos. What mechanism, other than a divine, transcendent system, could possibly have provided a universal reason to restrain base, self-serving impulses like violence and greed? Religion, you see, it filled a critical void. It taught humans that their actions mattered, that they had eternal consequences, even when there was no physical police force or government standing over them. It was an invisible infrastructure of moral enforcement.
Okay, I see why you emphasize that initial need for structure. I really do. But let's be clear about the nature of that order. That stability you mentioned was achieved through fear-based obedience, not voluntary moral commitment or reasoned inquiry. Religion created authority by dictating what not to question. It replaced the need for critical investigation with the comfort of just unquestioning faith. So while it did gather people together, it did so by suppressing their intellectual freedom.
And yet, it allowed for cooperation on a massive scale. Think about the capacity for compassion. Religion provided profound shared values that allowed strangers, people with no tribal or family connection, to cooperate, to trade, to build cities. And what's more, it provided a framework for enduring suffering. When life was brutish, short, and often just inexplicable, religion offered meaning. It gave comfort in the face of death and injustice, and that prevented societal despair and total collapse.
That meaning, however, came at the cost of facing reality. I just can't accept the premise that we were saved by a system that fundamentally slowed the pursuit of truth. We have concrete historical evidence showing that religious dogmas delayed scientific discovery by centuries. I mean, look at the persecution of early astronomers who dared to suggest the universe wasn't geocentric, a concept that was clearly observable but contravened scriptural interpretation.
I acknowledge those moments where institutional power clashed, often brutally, with nascent scientific inquiry. But you're focusing very narrowly on the later stages of its development. We're discussing the initial survival requirement. Without the shared values established by religion, how would a community possibly scale beyond a few hundred people? The shared narrative was the glue. It was the only way to establish universal norms.
But that glue was also used to justify unimaginable historical atrocities. The very framework you're celebrating was responsible for sanctioning slavery, institutional oppression, holy wars, all carried out with celestial justification. Humanity only truly began to accelerate its progress when society started the difficult work of separating verifiable fact from simple faith. Progress, freedom, and rational government, they all moved forward despite religion's dogmatic demands.
Okay, let's hone in on that concept of necessity then, specifically regarding morality. You seem to assume that morality is somehow innate, that concepts like do not kill or care for the weak would just naturally emerge into universally applied systems without being codified by a divine authority.
That's a provocative claim. I'm not so sure I agree with your premise that morality had to be externally imposed by a god to exist.
But history suggests otherwise, particularly in the formation of large, complex societies. Pre-religious morality was often strictly tribal or reciprocal. You don't kill my family, so I won't kill yours. Religion transformed that base, self-serving survival instinct into a universal ethical demand. It made the moral law applicable to strangers. It created the concept of a universal human duty. That restraint on tribal violence was the mechanism that prevented constant societal collapse in the ancient world. How else do you enforce the idea of universal brotherhood without a universal authority watching?
You're confusing the invention of morality with the monopolization of authority. Rules against theft or murder are not inherently divine. They are necessary parameters for the long-term functioning of any complex social species. Empathy, fairness, cooperation, these exist in primate communities and throughout the animal kingdom without requiring a divine mandate. Religion simply claimed ownership over these survival rules, rebranding them as cosmic law. And furthermore, your argument that religion restrains the worst impulses completely falls apart when you look at how often it moralizes cruelty.
Well, you're pointing to the corruption of the system, not the function of the core architecture. The foundational text established revolutionary ethical boundaries.
But the mechanism of implementation frequently resulted in the exact opposite of restraint. When we look at history, religion often sanctified violence. It declared war in the name of God, persecuted heretics, imposed excruciating punishments on those who merely held different beliefs. It didn't restrain the worst human impulses. It merely directed those impulses toward acceptable, divinely sanctioned targets, often making the most brutal acts completely immune to human criticism.
I concede that the institutional abuse of religious power is a dark stain on history, but the foundational structures were still crucial for allowing these large-scale groups to form in the first place, allowing revolutionary concepts like universal care for the poor or centralized charity to emerge. Let's move beyond structure for a moment and focus on the existential problem, which I believe is fundamental to human endurance. What about the necessity of meaning? Religion offered something that science, even today, really struggles to match: meaning in the face of inexplicable suffering and the finality of death.
That's a compelling point, because suffering is real and universal. But have you considered the intellectual cost of that comfort?
When you're faced with profound loss, systemic injustice, or just existential dread, religion offers hope that goes beyond mere logic. It assures people that their short, often painful lives matter in an eternal context, that spiritual sustenance is essential. A species that stares purely into the void of its own inevitable random death and suffering without any transcendent framework for hope. That is a species that I believe would struggle to maintain the social cohesion required for long-term endurance. It prevents the complete collapse into a pervasive, paralyzing despair.
I would counter that meaning based on illusion is inherently fragile, and more dangerously, it's passive. Religion offered comfort by giving easy, unverifiable answers, and it fundamentally taught humans to passively wait for salvation or divine intervention rather than actively confronting and improving the suffering in the real world. The scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, which are the hallmarks of true progress, they accelerated precisely when we learned to face reality without those supernatural guarantees. We started solving problems through engineering, medicine, and critical ethics when we accepted that meaning does not need to be eternal to be real, and that the responsibility for fixing suffering rests squarely on us.
But that's a modern mindset, though. You're applying the standard of a 21st century intellect, backed by centuries of established scientific method, to the fragile, pre-literate world. The ability of religious narratives to absorb and pacify that deep existential anxiety freed up human effort to be directed elsewhere, toward establishing trade routes, building infrastructure, and eventually developing those very intellectual traditions you celebrate. Without the stability provided by that initial existential comfort, I doubt the focused energy required for scientific innovation would have even been possible.
But the stability you described came tethered to oppressive doctrines that resisted necessary change. If the scaffolding is so crucial, why did humanity spend centuries trying to tear down or reform the most powerful parts of the religious establishment just to make intellectual room for progress?
Because it was humanity's first operating system. And I'd offer this as a synthesis. Religion was the initial architecture, the required software that enabled the complex programs of civilization to run it all. Yes, it was buggy. It was filled with exploits and certainly prone to crashing into violent conflicts. But it was necessary to launch the first global networks of cooperation and moral accountability.
See, I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, because calling it a necessary operating system implies a predetermined trajectory. I see it merely as a powerful ancient tool. It was highly useful when human knowledge was scarce, literacy was low, and centralized power was weak. But the danger lies in preserving that tool unchallenged and unupdated. When a tool based on faith is given absolute authority, it becomes dogma, and dogma actively resists the scientific method. Humanity no longer requires divine excuses to exercise responsibility for its actions, nor do we need fabricated cosmologies to inspire cooperation. Continuing to rely on the scaffolding long after the structure is built simply impedes essential maintenance, reform, and innovation. We need to be able to access those foundational files to edit and improve them.
But that foundation had to be strong enough to withstand the stress of centuries. So my final contention remains the profound, foundational necessity of religion in creating structure, in instilling universal meaning, and facilitating cooperation among millions of disparate people. These elements, they were not luxuries. They were prerequisites for the early survival of any complex, large-scale society. The sheer fact that these religious structures survived and thrived across every continent for millennia speaks to their functional utility in the pre-modern world.
And my conclusion stands that while its historical utility is undeniable, its continued presence imposed deep intellectual and social restraints. The greatest leaps in true human progress, in individual rights, empirical science, universal political freedom, occurred precisely through the secular separation of knowledge from authority. These advancements were often fought for, sometimes literally, against the entrenched dogmatic resistance of religious power.
We certainly agree on the incredible dual magnitude of religion's influence across history.
Indeed. The tension lies in whether we should prioritize the order it created at the start or the intellectual freedom it suppressed later on. The two seem intrinsically linked.
Perhaps the material suggests a synthesis where religion provided the essential survival bedrock for initial organization, while simultaneously establishing the rigid boundaries that later generations of thinkers and reformers had to overcome to pursue higher forms of intellectual and political freedom. It was, in a way, both the spark and the friction.
I agree. The most dangerous belief here is to assume the question has a simple singular answer. We have to always weigh the necessity of primal order against the cost of rigid dogma. Thank you for illuminating these critical and complex tensions.